second speaker, Ewert, and he will talk about crop modeling, untitled crop production, and we'll look into the advances and challenges from the PhenoRob perspective.
Thank you, Cyril. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I guess we have to change gears now, moving away from the experimentation to the more modeling activities, and also a bit more away from the soil towards the plant. There are many stories to tell about crop modeling and recent advances in crop modeling, and I had to focus this little seminar here, and I thought because of the PhenoRob Excellence Cluster, I primarily look at challenges and advances related to crop modeling that have a link to the activities that we plan in PhenoRob. When I prepared the seminar, I thought how many people would have experiences with crop modeling, and I asked that question now to you: how many have used crop models in their work? So this is what I feared and expected. Therefore, I will therefore I kept it, at least for the first part, rather general, to give you some background information on crop modeling. What is crop modeling? What do we understand about crop modeling? So that you better understand the second part when we take the PhenoRob perspective, particularly in PhenoRob we want to talk about sustainable crop production and interventions that we want to focus on, and which contribution crop modeling can make to these interventions. So this is a general outline of the next 30 minutes, and you're also free to interrupt if you have any questions on the way. We have different types of models around already. For many decades, people are using models in order to understand what effect certain inputs have on their performance of their crops. And a very typical model are these functional models, where people model empirically the response of a variable. It could be yield, an output variable, yield to an input variable, could be nitrogen fertilization, could be irrigation, whatever. And you get an empirical relationship, and that relationship can be quite helpful in order to analyze data under certain conditions, etc. And but if you want to understand why your output variable responds to the way it does to the input variable, and if you want to use such relationships for predictions, you run into limitations. These models are not suitable for predictions, and also not suitable in order to explain the behavior of your system. That was one of the reasons, or two of the reasons, why people started to look more into physiological processes, and in conjunction with the development in information technology, they were able to develop what we call mechanistic or process-based crop models. So these models have certain components, different components that resemble important physiological processes, what people think are important physiological processes, in order to explain, again, a certain behavior or a behavior of your system measured by considering certain variables, for instance, yield or biomass, in response to an input variable. But compared to this, you have much more. You have an explanatory level, which tells you why you see a certain response, and these models have also a certain predictive capacity. And one of the key locations where this has been pioneered and developed is the Wageningen University, and particularly Kees de Wit has introduced that and really pushed this concept in the 70s, and since then the community is steadily growing that uses crop models and applies crop models, and also links these model types with other types of models. Perhaps one important aspect or point to make here is to introduce what we call the system level and the process level. System level, process level. System level is typically what happens at the level of a crop. We're not talking about plants, we talk about field crops. There's a big difference. And the process level is the level at which different processes that we find important are considered and being included in the models. And these models are used for all sorts of applications, and all sorts of errors are made in using these models for all these different applications. Most importantly, these models have mainly or primarily developed to explain behavior at the population, at the field level, at the field crop level. So if you move away from that system level, you also need to change something apparently in your model. This is a little sketch of some of the processes that we typically consider in these models: assimilation, respiration, allocation, interception of radiation, phenology, and some link to soil processes. Wolf gave an elaborated talk of the recent advances in his research domain, and some of that will also eventually go into our crop modeling. Importantly to mention here is that different to the approach that a scientist like Wolf takes, for us as crop modeler, it is always important to understand the whole thing. The whole thing in this case is the crop system. So whenever we introduce something new, we try to understand the relevance of this new process in the context of the entire crop. So if someone tells me, well, I find this very important relationship in my root response, we try to consider that in the crop model only if it really matters in terms of explaining the behavior of the crop at the system level. It can be scientifically extremely interesting for an experimentalist, but in the context of a crop system, it may not be always relevant. And that's the job that we have to do in order to understand the relative importance and include it appropriately in the concept of how we understand the entire system. There's a range of impact variables to which these crop models are sensitive to, as our crops are sensitive in the field to. Atmosphere, we can group them into atmosphere, climate-related, soil-related, management-related, and there is a genetic component that is influenced by breeding. These are the main factor groups. And these models basically consider the variability in these factors, and some are mapped here, throughout a growing season. And they generate throughout a growing season a number of outputs related to, some of you have heard, or many of you have heard, leaf area index, biomass, grain yield, etc., root growth. So just a few examples. There's much more information generated. So the particular strength of these models is that they can consider a large number of interactions. You can imagine that if you have maybe 30 input variables that interact on different processes, and these processes also interact with each other, that there's a huge space, multi-dimensional space of possible interactions. And this is sort of captured by these models if they do a good job. And what they also do is they consider, different to the functional response models, they consider feedback loops. So whatever happens early in the season will have an effect to how our crop responds later in the season. So if leaf area index is sort of affected by drought early in the season, it will affect the simulations later in the season, and in turn also biomass production, yield production, etc. That's a particular strength and feature of these models, and they provide an explanation. So if you have a variability in your yields due to climate variability, due to management variability, the model will tell you why your yield has varied. Because photosynthesis was affected, or because your root system was affected. Those sort of explanation you can extract out of the model because you have that process level considered. At the process level, we are back to this functional relationship. At some stage we don't go further. If we want to explain everything, we are at the level of genetics. We go that direction, but we are far away from being there. In order to add more processes, there's also the problem of over-parameterization of models. So there is a certain skill in order to know how much detail you add to a model. A good crop modeler knows how much detail a model should have. Another concept that is very important in our PhenoRob cluster is the concept of the yield gap. That distinguishes between a potential yield that is determined by yield determining factors, and use some important factors here listed: CO2, radiation, temperature, and crop characteristics. And this potential yield is limited by fertilization, by nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, for instance, by water. And then you have another set of factors that further reduce the yield, pests, diseases, weeds, so that you eventually arrive at the actual yield. We have made great progress to model potential yield. We are increasingly getting better to model attainable yield. We are still at the beginning to really model the actual yield, because it's not easy and straightforward to model the effects of pest, diseases, etc. That's also has been an ambition of PhenoRob. For that, from that perspective, it is also very interesting for a crop modeler to get more information, data on the effects of pests and diseases in order to improve our models. But I will come back to that later. This is an example. There's lots of data around that you can use in order to train or test your model for simulating potential yield, limited yield, and actual yields. That's a long-term field experiment in Rothamsted. We also have a long-term field experiment in Diekopshof that we are more and more intensively using also for modeling purposes. And colleagues from the group are here. Sabine is working on this extensively right now, and these are good databases in order to test and improve our models. I pick out one of these factors here to give you a flavor of the complexity that is in these models. And I just look into temperature in order to show you how temperature affects different physiological processes. And you see here a response, a simplified relationship between the photosynthesis rate and temperature, with an optimum around 20-25 degrees Celsius. The respiration rate to temperature, different response. If you look into the rate of development to temperature, again a different response. And as far as high temperatures are concerned, there's a fourth response when it comes to the effect of high temperature stress on grain set that has again another shape. So most crop models consider all these relationships, but you want to consider these relationships in a way that the integral response of your biomass or yield response to, for instance, temperature increase is also well reproduced. Those relationships you get quite often from controlled environment experiments. But if you go to the field, if you really want to understand the yield response, you have to go to the field. And there it becomes sometimes difficult to find experimental setups in order to test those sort of relationships in the field. And we were lucky in this case to find an experiment in Arizona where people have tested the response of wheat to increasing temperature. And they were able to plot these or obtain those relationships, this relationship which you see here between grain yield and seasonal mean temperature, and the dots represent the observations. And the green line represents a median of 30 models that have been applied to this experiment. So the median is very close to the observation, which gives us great confidence, but we are very concerned about the individual lines. So there is a huge variability among the models. There's still quite some uncertainty in the models for a relatively simple relationship that we have been aware of and known and introduced in our models for more than 20 years. With the median, we can do more, and we did more in this study. We used and applied the models in order to assess globally the impact of temperature increase, global warming on wheat production, and in this case, just as a side information, an increase by 1 degree Celsius in global temperature would result in a 6% decline in global wheat production. Those sort of applications you could imagine with crop models. We can also do that, of course, at any smaller scale, field scale, farm scale, regional scale, whatever. We have, of course, asked ourselves, why do we have this large variability? What is causing that? And we looked again back into the individual processes, and you can see here just for the simulation of the phenology rate or the rate of development that there are quite different response functions used in the different models, and there are reasons why people use different functions. That applies to one process. If you look into other processes, which I've shown you before, photosynthesis, biomass production, leaf senescence, leaf growth, same picture, quite a range of differences in how models reproduce or use the temperature response of individual processes. And that is, of course, something where we are at the beginning to understand and use these insights in order to improve our models. Another aspect that comes into play here is what temperatures do we use if we stay with temperature. We've always assumed that we have good measurements if we use the 2-meter height measurements that are provided by the German Weather Service and also by experimental weather stations. But we found out, it's not only that we found it out, but also our data showed that there can be quite a deviation between air temperatures measured at 2 meters height and canopy temperature. And this shows you the relationship between the canopy temperature and the air temperature. And you see how much this can deviate depending on whether your crop is irrigated or not, depending on soil conditions. So that means with this, by using the air temperature, you also introduce an error, in addition to what I've shown you before with the differences in the model responses to temperature. And we have spent, and I will not have the time here today, a great deal of work in order to improve our modeling of canopy temperature, because it's the canopy temperature to which our physiological processes are sensitive to, not the air temperature. And for that reason, it's good to have a project like this, where we are able, with sensing technologies, to get much better information on those sort of input variables. Canopy temperature is just one, that's photosynthesis related measurements, etc., that become interesting in that context. So there is still quite a model uncertainty that we want to have to address, related to the input data, but also related to the model, to the models themselves, to the structure, and I've given you an example for temperature, but also related to the parameters that are used in the models. I will not go into this part here in this little seminar. I will now make the step to the PhenoRob excellence cluster. And this is a picture that you all are aware of. That was a slide in our presentation when we defended the proposal. It depicts our vision that we have towards sustainable crop production by reducing inputs of fertilizer chemicals, increase resource use efficiencies, enhance climate resilience, and use integrated multifunctional robots in crop management systems. So that was our broad vision that we sketched there. And then we had one question at this defense, which was quite challenging, I think, and that referred to what are your interventions that you're looking at. Some of you may remember that were present. And I'm posing this question now to the broader audience. What are our interventions in PhenoRob? Why do we do all this? There's, of course, always the scientific ambitions, but there's also, in the context of the bigger picture, towards sustainable crop production, the ambition to eventually come with proposals of intervention. Anybody remembers that? Okay. Yeah? Go ahead.
I remember the question.
And what was the answer?
On the soil science, is that
You don't have much intervention, no. This is the key question, huh? What are the interventions? Yeah?
Yeah, I mean...
You answered it. You tried. We did better in the break.
That's a blank. I have no idea what I said. But I'm just thinking now, and I'm also thought about your modeling. I mean, I think what the interventions can be, or one of the main would be around patchiness. So what PhenoRob potentially can do is see where these yield gaps are more or less in a particular area. And so that the intervention is allowing the farmer to redistribute their inputs into places that need versus not. So I see that sort of as an outcome of it, not that we're designing or proposing what they should put on, but a more strategic way of application.
That's one aspect. Yes.
And then maybe you can answer it later. So to I was wondering about to what extent are your models dealing with patchiness?
I will come to this.
Yeah, okay.
I will come to this. This is the second part.
Yeah.
So I obviously wasn't there for that discussion, but I would say it's about looking at the fact that a lot of the intervention at the moment is homogeneous, and what you can do with these kind of systems is think about how you can do things in a more precise and structured manner.
That's right. So that's another part. And there's this third one, which is related to breeding. These are our three main interventions: breeding, phenotyping, using phenotyping in conjunction with crop modeling in order to enhance breeding for sustainable crop production, crop management, precision ag, etc., and field arrangements. Field arrangements can be a subset of crop management. I've separated that out because we also kept that separate. These are our key interventions. And the second part of this seminar, I will sort of try to look into what crop modeling can contribute to that, what we have done most recently in these contexts, and what are the great challenges here. From my perspective, the most exciting things in crop modeling in this context is in conjunction with breeding and in conjunction with field arrangements. But this is only my personal view. So there is a value of using models in aiding phenotyping. We have this development of the phenotyping platforms, but there is a potential, and I will make that clear throughout the following slides, of modeling to further aid this phenotyping. And what I mean here is to quantify the genotype times environment and times management. I keep in brackets because we are in a very early stage here, interactions for yield, for our complex traits, but also for our morphophysiological traits. So if you imagine that we have these morphophysiological traits early in the development of a crop, they eventually affect our complex traits that we are interested in. But these relationships are not straightforward. They are affected by many factors related to the environment, related to management. And crop modeling can be very powerful in order to disentangle the effects of management, environment, in interaction with the genotype, in explaining the variability of the phenotypic expression of your complex traits. That's what breeders and farmers are interested in. And that's where crop models are very powerful, because they have this very multidimensional space that they can explore in silico. And we have made an example. We were interested in a study to understand, under conditions of climate variability, what traits are particularly important if temperature, I'm back to my example of temperature, if temperature varies, if temperature increases. And we found out from a modeling study that it is the development rate, particularly the date of anthesis, the occurrence of the date of anthesis, and the grain filling rate. These two things, these two traits are quite important to explain variability in yield in response to temperature. So in order to then test that your assumptions in the model are solid, you want to look for data that sort of back you up, give you the confidence that any changes in anthesis state or in grain filling rate have a relation to relative change in the yield, a relative change in protein yield. We've been also interested in protein here in that study, and a change in the protein concentration. And you can see that there is quite good relationships. Once you have this sort of tested, you can use models in order to assess what will happen in a future changing climate if temperature increases with your yield. And this is the left part of these circles that measures the change in the grain yield and the change in the protein yield. That's the right bluish part of the individual locations, 60 locations across the world, for which we run a multi-model ensemble of more than 30 models. And you get this sort of a response without adaptation, and then you will think of how can you adapt your traits in a warmer climate, and with adaptation you get this response. And you can see how the blueness gets bluer and the redness also changes if you consider adaptation. Again, this can be applied to all different scales down to the field level, these sort of general approaches. There are much more traits that are important and there's not only temperature that plays a role. We know that this is a way of structuring these traits that are potentially important. There are still more to that, but these are some traits that physiologists that work with breeders closely together find important. And there's an increasing recognition of the power of crop models to be used in the pre-breeding in order to identify the promising traits and give this information to breeders to particularly look at these traits. And we are presently, we've just started 2 weeks ago, we had a kickoff workshop in Oklahoma where we started an international project with CIMMYT, that's the International Wheat and Maize Breeding Institute, and where we try to use crop models in order to support breeding programs for wheat. And one of the tasks there is to perform an environmental classification, to delineate your target environments for which you want to breed and consider certain traits, promising traits. That's an important first step to take, and that's one of the activities that we're doing in this project. Again, also applicable to Germany, to any other place from the basic methodology. Okay, there's a problem here. So, another point where crop modeling is very powerful, the third part actually is, if you look at the selection funnel for in a pedigree wheat breeding program, you see that a breeder starts with a large number of crossings of lines. Huh? Yeah?
Maybe just have a short question. You said that you could use crop models for finding promising traits.
Mm-hmm.
Can you also go the other way around and test whether a trait which we think can be important or test this?
Yeah, sure. Yes, if you come and say, well, I think, let's say you talked about root, my root length, my root depth is important, my rooting depth is important, we build this into the crop model and can test the importance of it. And we will see in some environments it is important, in some it is not important. In some root depth is not important, for instance, in certain environments in Australia. We've seen studies on this one. It's more the root density distribution in the upper layers, those sort of things you get out. It can be quite helpful as a first indication then to further experimentally investigate that. Yeah. Another application is that, again, if you look at the selection funnel in a pedigree wheat breeding program, breeders start with, in the F2 generation, second generation after the crossing, they still look at 2 million lines. This is a large number of lines. And only in the F6 they go into a field nursery. That means only there, this could be a field nursery, only there they start looking at yield. And they mainly only look at yield. Now with the new phenotyping platforms, we are able to also look into traits and get much more information about the physiological traits and relate these traits to yield variability. But the disadvantage of these platforms is they are quite expensive. And if you install a platform here in this area, you only have it here. If you have a gradient in your climate, this is an integrated measure of indicator of a climate in Germany. And if you then also consider soil variability, there's an element of how much information you get from one point about the G times E if you want to say something about the diversity of environments that you have in a small country like Germany. And there, crop modeling can also be very helpful in order to extrapolate, to scale out information that you obtain in one location. Okay, the M part, I've not said much about the management part. It is important in our project. Management in the G times E concept is, we're just starting to understand that, but there's a great study just came out and we've been asked to give a commentary on this. It's a great study from Australia where people have used the crop model to understand the importance of management and also the importance of certain traits for yield responses to climate variability. And they looked at the enhance of a change in the sowing strategy across different locations in the Australian wheat belt. and they combined that with the change in the earliness of or lateness of a variety of the varieties. So that's a trait. So this management G times M interaction and then tested for different environments was then used in a breeding program, and they've developed varieties that had these features, and these varieties showed really superior behavior in these environments, and that is the result that came out of the study, the yield benefit because of these two strategies that came out of a modeling study. So it's a very nice example of how this can integrate nicely. The second part, second intervention, crop management, we have mentioned weeding and fertilization and irrigation. And here I will be relatively short because Harry gave a good presentation on this one. We're talking about the avatars and the data assimilation part, so I don't need to go into this. Just a few comments in response to that presentation and perhaps some additional remarks. There is lots of activities in this field. It's not only us as scientists, there are different scientific groups working on this. There's also the industry putting lots of effort into advancing in this, on this intervention level. This is just one example. Class not the only one. John Deere, we know, BASF, etc. Harry made the comment, and he had that little picture where he measured the electric conductivity, and by using those information in conjunction perhaps with other information, there was the hypothesis that we could improve also our model prediction capabilities. Now we've done a study at South, just being published, where people have compared conventional measurements, that's a field site, 60 points measured soil characteristics, compared with the measurement, with the simulation based on measurements of electric conductivity. And they run the same model for these two setups. Also, this is the high resolution simulation compared to the point simulation. And these are some results. Interestingly, still, if you use these point simulations, the model performance still appears to be better as compared to these high resolution simulations. There are different reasons for that. People are trying to understand that now. But certainly, it is not that bad, and it is much easier to get this information than this information. Another point that we should make in this context is that we have this large variability among models. I mentioned that already. Again, for this site was a model comparison performed among 10 models, and you see with respect to yield, soil water storage, and mineralization, how variable the models can be for 3 years on that location. And again here, the multi-model ensemble performs relatively well in comparison to the observations. These are the observations, this is the multi-model ensemble. The circles are on the same line, on the same height. So there's a good agreement, but for individual model, if you take just one model, and if you have no idea about crop modeling, you can be in big trouble. You basically don't do it. Okay, so because of that uncertainty in the models, we have made also in our group here in Bonn quite an effort to understand the importance and the uncertainty that comes with certain assumptions of modeling physiological processes. And that's an example that refers to the water use. And there are different aspects that come in if you model water use. You have to model soil water retention and flux. You have to model reference evapotranspiration. You have to model crop water extraction, soil water evaporation, and you have a root model. And there are different versions for each of these aspects how people model. This is not exhaustive. These are just some examples. But you can use also our modeling setup in order to get an understanding how sensitive your overall model behavior is, depending on which of these subroutines you consider. And you may come to, in this case, we found out that the sensitivity of our overall performance was very much determined by the assumptions, by the model for simulating reference evapotranspiration. in two locations. In one location in New Zealand, and in another location it was the simulation of soil evapotranspiration. Now those sort of analysis give you an understanding of where you could potentially improve the model. And of course these things will have an implication in simulation. This is simulation of if ET assumptions about reference evapotranspiration have an effect on your impact simulation, and this is the simulation of the net irrigation requirement for Europe, you can get a feeling of, if you take the one of the four approaches, how different your impact calculations can be and your modeling error can be. That's a deviation, it's a spatial pattern of that error that you make, a deviation from the Penman motif of the Penman, the Hargreaves, and the Priestley-Taylor. All are still used in models. All these things are still used. These modeling frameworks, we've developed this modeling framework Simplace in our group. There are also other modeling frameworks around the world, can be very helpful in order to do these studies. And they are also very helpful in order to do this ensemble modeling, which I think is at the moment, given our limited understanding, the best way to go ahead. So I come now to one other comment where I will not go into. It's the functional structural plant modeling. We've discussed that several times here. There's some activities ongoing on the root part. There's also quite some activities on the above ground part. We are not working ourselves on this, but there's certainly a potential in terms of exploring certain traits with the functional structural plant model, and also in exploring the importance of certain weeds for crop growth and yield. But I will just keep this here to remind you that this is also an area of modeling that is quite actively evolving. My last part of the presentation refers to the third intervention, and you mentioned that, these arrangements. And I start with what we call mixed crop, row crop, strip cropping. And we can use crop models in order to explore the effectiveness of mixed crop, row crop, strip cropping. And there are examples where people have done that. This is an example where different ways of combining a maize crop with a soybean crop are tested. And whether you have them row by row, a row crop, or whether you have them in a strip crop format, or whether you vary, or to which extent you should or could vary the distances between the rows. And this is only for 2 crops. So you've got already 4 options here. If you imagine we have maybe 30, 40 crops grown in Germany, there's quite a room, again, to explore. And models can be very helpful in phenotyping that. And you get information out of, for instance, with respect to leaf area index, how your sole soybean crop performs as compared to the combinations in 2 years. And this should be 2014. And your maize crop, again, in these 2 years, and the differences between the sole maize and the combination are relatively small for leaf area index because the plants are just larger. So the effect of the shading is much more pronounced in affecting leaf area index for the soybean crop as for the maize crop. And you can also then calculate the effects on dry matter and calculate the land equivalent ratio and see how effective those combinations are in a sustainable production context in order to improve your sustainability. Good. Last point, patch cropping. We call it patch cropping. It's not coined yet, that term. We've seen that before. We presently discuss precision agriculture in a way that we have these heterogeneous fields. Wolf also made a point about that, soil heterogeneity, by treating the different parts in the field differently with nitrogen fertilization, etc. But we may also think of accounting for that variability by our arrangements of the crops. And that we have seen very little. These are 2 examples of what we call contour cropping, contour farming. But we know very little of the potential that's in this approach. And We are also particularly interested in this in the whole discussion of biodiversity, ecosystem services. If you see here a relationship between the reliability of landscape complexity as biodiversity and ecosystem provider. So landscape complexity, pollinator diversity, pollination, grain yield. These are symbolic relationships, not well tested. There's a great potential. It's really absolutely exciting, this field just starting up. And crop modeling can be extremely valuable in order to explore these different options. Just at the beginning. And we have, of course, ambitions here as well to move ahead. So there is these relationships that we assume, more hypothetical relationships, that if you move from mixed cropping, strip cropping, patch cropping to monoculture, there is an adaptation benefit somewhere. You can also think of combinations between patch and mixed cropping. It's an adaptation benefits. The intensity of interactions between plants and partner plants is something we need to understand and want to have adequately represented in the model. And there's a range of challenges, I'm not reading them all out to you, that comes with it. Oh, there's a whole issue of traits coming in again. You need complete different traits if you grow a wheat crop in such a mixture than if you grow a wheat crop in a monoculture. This very exciting field also with respect to the how do you manage this, and there's certainly great potential of using sensing and robotics in this context, because I think these new technologies will be a great enabler of these new farming approaches. So concluding remarks from this, I think there's considerable progress in crop modeling in different areas, many areas. There's still a large model uncertainty which we face. That is one of the reasons why I always say a crop model should not go without a crop expert. So you shouldn't use a crop model if you're not a crop physiologist or a crop scientist somehow and have that expertise. There is another way, or in addition to that, we think and propagate that ensemble modeling is a very helpful tool to at least capture some of that uncertainty. There's a great potential in crop modeling for PhenoRob interventions, and there's a great potential by linking the PhenoRob technologies, crop modeling, artificial intelligence, sensing. Thank you very much.
So one of your statements, if I got it right, was that the individual crop models still have an uncertainty in their predictions, so you have a large variability of your output.
No.
By combining multiple of the models, for example, by combining the median, however, you get actually a pretty good prediction of what happens on the field. And this is what you refer to as ensemble modeling.
Yeah.
So what's the problem with this ensemble modeling? Is it now solved if we simply use our 30 or 40 models and just go for the median? Or what's the problem with this approach?
Why do you see a problem in this approach?
No, I don't see a problem, but is this now solved, the whole issue, because we simply use our 30 models?
Yeah. Okay, so we have done different studies. We have seen, at least in the applications where we have tested that you don't need always 30 models. You need something, we don't have something to draw. You need something in the range of 6 to 8 models to be already as good as with 30 models. This is almost a saturation response, and for the application where we have tested it. And but we still cannot exclude that there may be application where even the ensemble mean is not a good predictor. Yeah, so we cannot exclude that yet. It's only like empirical knowledge from the many studies that have been done, increasingly done. And we always see that the multimodal mean is better than the prediction of individual models.
Maybe related to that one.
Yeah.
If you say that 6 to 8 models are sufficient already to get a better estimate than just one model, how do you select these?
Yes, we tested that. We tested out of this exercise with the 30 and more models. Any combination of the 6 to 8 models was better. It didn't matter which model we choose. It was almost independent. Any combinations, it just needed to be 6 to 8 models. That was very interesting, surprising to us as well, because we always thought there are the good modeling groups, so they've been modeling for 20 years, they do a good job, and then you have these groups that perhaps are less experienced, and if you just take the very experienced groups, you may need less. We didn't see that pattern. Yeah.
So you asked a question about what kind of interventions.
Yeah.
That's of course one element. I think in PhenoRob it's also important to ask the question, who will do the intervention?
Oh yeah.
And this is something I thought that was one of the focus we had in PhenoRob, because you can do the modeling and still say, well, farmer, this is what you need to do. That would be the typical, the classical way. So my question would be, and this is also to what I think, if you do this model, who are you going to inform? And it should not be, well, the intention of PhenoRob was not to inform the farmer. The intention of PhenoRob was to inform some kind of robotic system. I'm just trying to...
I think, I understand your point. I think the intention of PhenoRob is to develop methods, packages, however tools, however you want to call it, in order to improve these interventions. It's not that we will go to the farmer, but we will develop, a set of methods that could be used and improve sustainable crop production. That's the overarching vision.
Well,
you're not happy with that?
Yeah, well, you still need to make the link between the model and the system that is operating. This is the point I try to make it in the presentation. So
yeah.
Say, okay, I have a drone flying, and the drone informs, you have a sensing system that informs your model, but then what do you do with the outcome of the model? And then you have to also inform somebody to do the intervention. So what kind of intervention? That can be whatever, it can be weeding, it can be fertilizing, but the question is, where do you go from your model output to your operating system? And I think it is something we need to still...
Yeah, I would say this is not the primary focus of this cluster. I guess our interest is to have the technology of using sensing, modeling, artificial intelligence in order to provide a tool or set of tools that these interventions can be made more qualified.
Yeah, sure, but then the focus is on the improvement of the tool,
yeah,
to inform.
But you still have to reflect on the interventions that you want to do. That was my point.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I understand, but you have to put this, what kind of interventions to me in the automated approach that is being advocated by PhenoRob, and that makes it a bit more difficult.
I didn't say it's easy.
No. It would be easier if you would just develop a toolbox and inform the farmers. That would be the easiest way. And you could still say, I'm still improving my toolbox, but my target audience is the farmer. And there is no intermediate, so the farmer is the operator, the farmer is the machine.
I'm not even sure. I don't know whether it's always the farmer. Maybe in most cases it is, but it's not so relevant. So it's more relevant from, if you want to talk about sustainable crop production, you have several ways of improving, getting there. And these were, at least from my perspective, also from the discussion that we have, the main entry points or points of intervention. And that doesn't mean that we do the interventions, but we prepare of improving the interventions.
A similar question. So you said you have these three types of interventions. It was breeding, crop management, and field arrangement. And you said that personally you would be most interested in field arrangement and breeding. But I think from a robotics perspective, crop management is perhaps the most interesting thing. Or where do you see the robot?
Well, this was my personal, let's say, perspective, also seeing where the research front is, where people that also are active in the domain presently are, and where the gaps are the biggest. So from that perspective, I made that comment. That does not exclude that there is a great deal, and I refer to the presentation Harry gave, and I fully are in line with what was said, the potential that we have in using robotics and sensing in order to improve crop management in present sort of setups of crops, monocrops. I think robotics has a great deal to contribute also in this, in the field arrangements. I think this is amazing what you could imagine there if you can let go the rectangular field arrangements and go to polygons, just following the contours of your soil heterogeneity, and because you have the small scale technology in order to do that, and if you can let go the row principle, all our crops are grown in rows. There are disadvantages to that if it comes to weed competition. You can arrange from an ecological perspective plants much more smartly if you want to reach weed suppression, but presently we can't because we are bound to the technologies that we have. Yeah. So if you have a homogeneous distribution of seeds, the competition power of your crop is much higher as compared to a row crop, which is for the first 30 days bare soil where the wheat can just grow. Yeah. 30 centimeters not for wheat, by the way. It's 12 in wheat. Yeah.
I think, if I can interpret what Harry was saying, I do think that one important question is to what extent can the crop models basically inform on the go within crop decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So the really interesting examples you showed about success with modeling in Australia, the deep-rooted and then the timing of sowing and flowering.
Yeah, but this was not on the during the management activities.
That's exactly what
No,
I was going to say.
no, I didn't.
That was really,
Yeah,
I'm just going to let
I didn't go into this because this was all presented already. I didn't want to repeat that.
No, exactly. I just, I know you know that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that I would see the real challenge generally globally with modeling and with other groups is using the information that you're obtaining off the crop at the time into some sort of predictive model to provide as quickly as possible the action for the intervention.
Absolutely.
And I think the question is how do you actually physically link the information off the crop model into an intervention model, maybe, like the avatar. So do we need another model in between? Is there another type of model?
I think you may need another model in between if your crop model or whatever model, how you want to call it, let's call it crop model, still requires is too slow.
Yeah,
can be a computational limitation. Then you may have some advantage by using artificial intelligence because you have already explored the space with your crop model and have trained your artificial intelligence approach with that data, and you will be much faster then to come to a decision for the device in order to treat the plants. Yeah. I think this is a computational constraint. We see how fast things will go. At the moment, if you want to run scenarios, and that's what we will do, in order to make a good decision, probably we are too slow still. Well, I would think so. Depends how fast your device goes.
Well, it depends on how the spatial and temporal rate of what it is you're intervening on against the recording of that situation and then being able
Well, if you have a sensor that is maybe half a meter ahead, the sensor senses the status of the plant, and that goes then to the model, that information. The model calculates the demand of nitrogen depending on what is expected in terms of growth, and then makes a decision. So that has to happen if you can calculate, if your device goes maybe kilometer per hour,
And
how
that's
fast
the
that should go.
But that's the scenario where you already know that you're going to intervene with nitrogen. There will be other scenarios where you have to figure out what the application should be, and then the farmer has to go back and arrange for the input or the robot. But anyway,
I think you can. I think that is what you mentioned is a more general systems understanding. What are the dominantly limiting factors in your area, in your farm? This is what you can do during winter time with a lot of data that you have available from last year's to say, well, it's always nitrogen, you have a phosphorus problem, you have a drought problem regularly, those sort of things.
No, I'm also thinking about pest interventions and
Oh yeah, okay.
other dynamic situations that your farmer is acting in
Yeah.
all the time. I think there's a lot of interesting aspects.
Yeah. Yes,
that
absolutely.
are very new to modeling.
But we constrained us to few management activities in PhenoRob to demonstrate this advantage. Huh?
Well,
That is my understanding. We
well,
said
pest
nitrogen.
feeds, nitrogen.
Yes.
That's already quite a few. But anyway, yeah.
There's a hand. Yeah.
I guess just on the same topic, are there certain assumptions about what you're modeling in terms of what your expected intervention is? I guess that's what...
I didn't hear you acoustically.
Are there certain assumptions about what kind of interventions you can actually do based on your model? So your model is taking certain information and processing that, providing output. Is that output either implicitly or explicitly making assumptions about what you can do and at what spatial or temporal scale you can do things? I guess that's my question in a robotic sense. Are you making an assumption that you can only apply things at a 1 square meter scale?
That is a very good point. That's a, yeah. Yeah. I think you would do this, certainly I would see an immediate relevance of this if it comes to pests and diseases. If you sort of sense a pest and if you sense a very, pest infected plant, you may come to the conclusion intervention, spray. But if you see the entire field, and that's your question, I think, it changes the scale, and the entire field, that plant makes only up 1% of the area, then you may come to a different conclusion. But that information, that it is only 1% of the area, you only know once you have driven all across the field, or you have a different sensing technology for that. I think that's a very relevant question. You can even take it further to the farm level and make a farm level decision. Very exciting. Great.
Or even do you need to apply it at a 1 square meter scale, at a plant scale?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should talk about that.
How do you do that?
Yeah. So far, I think we have discussed it in a way that we didn't consider that scale aspect. No, we are in a certain location of the field. There is a problem, there is a deficiency, and then we come to an action. Yeah. But I share your point absolutely.
Can I add to that? It's not only the spatial scale, it's also the temporal. So if you give information about how the crop price will be in 5 months, you may not want to spray as much as you would do if you expect a high crop price.
I think we would have some approaches to start off with at least. What you typically do is that you run certain scenarios. You run with weather conditions of the last year, maybe the last average of the 10 years, years that are alike of what you have experienced in the present years, and those sort of things. There are some experiences already, but it is not resolved. If you would have better weather predictions for a longer time period ahead, that would certainly be very variable. But we haven't. We will not have
It just makes
soon.
The management decision
Yeah.
a more complicated one if you include
Yeah.
all the economic criteria that matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thanks, that was very helpful for me, that talk. I'm still not very happy with the scale. So in the current model, what is the scale of these processes that you were talking about? So you have a process model and then the system that you...
This is the scale. A homogeneous field.
And what?
a crop, a field stand, several plants standing together affecting each other. It's not a single...
Relationships in these processes that you model somehow, where it's empirical or physiological or whatever, it's all on this homogeneously assumed scale.
Yes.
And how difficult it is to go smaller. I mean, if you do this intervention, then you have to go smaller, or do you just build the mean of the two crops?
No, you would always try to understand. I mean, you operate at a field scale. You probably wouldn't look at individual plants with respect to how this plant will develop. You would try to understand how the patch would develop, although you may still sense individual plants, but you would, in terms of your prediction, you would always refer to the crop.
Actually, I meant intercropping, not intervention. So how do you model this? Because then you have to look at smaller scales or not in these mixed cropping environments.
Yes. I mean, in this, with two crops, the example I showed you, that's a study where people have used, and that's a starting point, but we are in a relatively early phase. You can use two crop models, and you can have a radiation model in this case, assuming how the radiation interception is affected for this crop by the larger crop. And then you will basically run the crop models as they are. The only thing that changes here would be radiation, but this is not quite true. We know this. There's also temperature, and you can spend quite some time in understanding the temperature gradient, radiation gradient, CO2 gradient, all that. But I think the most dominant factor will be the light interception that is affected. Yeah, and that will also that also explains, I think, in this paper there's also a graph. There are also graphs on light interception. They have measured light interception and simulate light interception. So you, as a starting point, you can pretty much use present crop models. I call them here mixed crop model. You have a model for soybean, you have a model for maize, you have an account for the radiation. We are not accounting here, there's something below ground. Now I skipped this slide, I deleted it. This is much more complex. These two plants have different root systems. There's also the niche concepts that certain plants have a root system that explores the soil volume that is not used by the other plant. There's some great potential there. This is more complicated below ground. Yeah. But we have the root area here as well, very prominently represented, so there may be some progress as well.
That's a final question. Quality assuring, so how do you ensure that if there are models that haven't been developed in collaboration with a crop expert, as you said, how do you make sure that the research that's coming out of that is still...
Peer review. It's the only way at the moment. Yeah, and conferences and exchange and yeah. I mean, you have some. There are some principles. Let's say, how do we call it? Good principles of good modeling practice that modelers are supposed to follow. So there are some papers that sort of, explain these principles and how you should calibrate a model. That you, before you apply a model, how you test the model, how you show the testing result of the model, those sort of things. But there are no strict criteria of how well the model should perform in order to be applied for a certain application. This is not carved in stone.
Okay, with this,
yeah?
spend more than an hour.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.